November 1943, Camp Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. 3 German prisoners of war stood in the freezing morning air, watching something massive approach in the distance. The ground beneath their feet trembled. A low rumble grew louder with each passing second. Hauptmann Ernst Weber squinted through the snow, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The machine was enormous, a locomotive pulling some kind of specialized car with a giant circular blade on the front. Metal teeth jutted out from the spinning mechanism like the jaws of a mechanical monster. Weber's first thought was simple and terrifying. They're going to execute us with it. He wasn't alone in his fear. Next to him, young Gefreiter Klaus Hoffmann had gone pale, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps that created small clouds in the cold air. On Weber's other side, an Obergefreiter Friedrich Müller stood quietly, his teacher's mind trying to puzzle out what they were witnessing. But even Müller looked uncertain, his usually calm eyes showing traces of the same dread that gripped them all. This moment, this machine roaring toward them through the Canadian snow, was not where their story began. To understand how 3 German soldiers ended up in southern Alberta, convinced they were about to die by some terrible weapon, you had to go back 6 months to the scorching deserts of North Africa. May 1943 had marked the end of the Afrika Korps. In Tunisia, 275,000 Axis soldiers surrendered to Allied forces. It was a crushing defeat, one that Berlin tried desperately to hide from the German people back home. Weber had been there at the Mareth line when British forces overran his position. Shrapnel from an artillery shell had torn into his shoulder and leg. His unit scattered, overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. When British soldiers found him bleeding in a ditch, Weber had expected to be shot. Instead, they bandaged his wounds and gave him water. Klaus Hoffmann was just 21 when he became a prisoner. A Bavarian farm boy conscripted in 1941, he'd never wanted to be a soldier. When Allied forces surrounded his unit in the Tunis pocket, Hoffmann surrendered, ashamed of his relief. Friedrich Müller was older at 38, a Dresden schoolteacher forced into a Panzer crew. When his tank broke down during a retreat, he surrendered. A skeptical man by nature, he'd never quite believed the propaganda he'd been forced to teach. All 3 men had been fed the same lies about what would happen if they were captured. The propaganda was specific and terrifying. Canadian forces were portrayed as savage imperial soldiers who tortured prisoners. They would be shipped to the frozen Arctic wastelands of Canada, forced to mine minerals in sub-zero temperatures until they died of cold or starvation or exhaustion. Death before dishonor, their officers had told them. Surrender is treason. Better to die fighting than face what the Allies will do to you. But they had surrendered, and now they faced the consequences. First came processing at a temporary holding camp in North Africa. Then they were loaded onto British transport ships, packed into the lower decks with hundreds of other German POWs. Weber remembered the moment an officer announced their destination through a translator. "You're being shipped to Canada for the duration of the war." The word Canada rippled through the prisoners like electricity. Men went pale, some began to pray. Canada meant the frozen death they'd been promised. Canada meant the end. As the ship pulled away from the North African coast, Weber stood at the rail, watching the land disappear. Beside him, Hoffmann trembled despite the desert heat. "They're really taking us there," the young man whispered. "To the Arctic. To die." Müller stood nearby, silent. His teacher's mind was already noting contradictions, the professional behavior of the guards, the adequate food, the medical care, but he kept these observations to himself. Doubt was dangerous, even among fellow prisoners. The journey would take weeks. None of them knew that every day of that voyage would chip away at what they believed. None of them could imagine that the frozen wasteland waiting for them would shatter every lie they'd been told. And none of them, not Weber with his rigid military certainty, not Hoffmann with his farm boy innocence, not Müller with his educated skepticism, could possibly predict that a simple machine built to clear snow would become the moment their entire understanding of the world collapsed forever. But first, they had to survive the crossing. First, they had to reach Canada. And first, they had to see with their own eyes whether the enemy was truly the monster they'd been taught to fear. The Atlantic crossing had lasted nearly 4 weeks, and every day brought small surprises that chipped away at what the prisoners thought they knew. The ship was crowded, packed with hundreds of German POWs in the lower decks, but the conditions were nothing like the horror stories they'd been told. Each morning, British sailors brought down breakfast, porridge with actual sugar, tea that was hot and real, and bread that didn't have sawdust mixed into the flour. Weber watched the other prisoners eat with confused expressions on their faces. This was more food than they'd seen during their final months fighting in the Tunisian desert. The British guards carried rifles but rarely showed any cruelty. They were professional soldiers doing a job, not the savage torturers described in German propaganda. When one young prisoner got into a fight over a sleeping spot, or the guards separated them firmly but didn't beat anyone, Weber had seen Wehrmacht officers whip soldiers for smaller offenses. This restraint felt wrong, like a trick he couldn't quite figure out. Müller studied everything from the deck. In Liverpool, he watched ships loading endless supplies. The port was busy, not devastated, as German newsreels claimed. Where was the desperation? Müller kept his observations to himself. Hoffmann was miserably seasick for the first week. The North Atlantic in November was brutal, with waves that tossed the ship like a toy. A British medic gave him pills that actually helped settle his stomach. The medic even asked about his family, showed him a photo of his own children back in England. Hoffmann found himself talking about his younger brother, still fighting somewhere on the Eastern Front, and the medic nodded sympathetically. "Hope he makes it home safe, lad," he said. The kindness confused Hoffmann more than cruelty would have. Enemies weren't supposed to care about each other's brothers. The transfer to a Canadian ship brought even better conditions. Instead of hammocks, they had actual beds with mattresses. The meals came 3 times a day on a regular schedule. There was coffee, real coffee, not the burnt grain substitute they'd been drinking in the Wehrmacht for 2 years. Canadian guards were more relaxed than the British, willing to have brief conversations with prisoners who spoke English. One guard, a man named Corporal MacDonald, offered Hoffmann a cigarette during a deck break. When Hoffmann hesitated, MacDonald smiled. "Go on, son. We're not monsters." During the crossing to Halifax, Weber found himself standing at the rail one evening, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of orange and red. Another prisoner joined him, a former factory worker from Munich. "They're feeding us better than our own army did," the man whispered. "Why would they do that if they plan to kill us?" Weber had no answer. The contradiction gnawed at him. Everything his officers had told him, everything the propaganda films had shown, said the Allies were barbaric and desperate, but desperate nations don't waste good food on enemy prisoners. Halifax appeared through morning fog. The enormous harbor bustled with ships and cranes. The prisoners were marched into a heated processing building. Heated. In Germany, civilians froze while Canadians warmed enemy prisoners. The medical examination was thorough and professional. A Canadian doctor looked at Weber's wounds, which had mostly healed during the voyage. The doctor cleaned them again, applied fresh bandages, and made notes on a chart. "You'll be fine," he said through a translator. "We'll keep an eye on these to make sure there's no infection." The medical facility had more equipment than the field hospitals Weber had seen in North Africa. This was for prisoners. What did their real hospitals look like? They were given winter clothing before boarding the train west. The coat Hoffman received was thick wool, well made, with no holes or patches. The boots were new leather, properly sized. Gloves, scarves, warm socks, everything a man would need to survive a Canadian winter. Mueller examined his coat carefully, checking the stitching and fabric quality. It was better than anything issued to German troops. He caught Weber's eye and saw his own thoughts reflected there. How rich must this country be to give such good equipment to prisoners? The train journey took days through heated passenger cars. Through the windows, endless prosperity rolled past. Farmhouses with electric lights, automobiles on paved roads, intact towns. Hoffman counted more cattle in one Canadian field than in his entire Bavarian village. Weber stared out the window as the Rocky Mountains appeared in the distance. He'd been told Canada was a flat, frozen wasteland where prisoners would mine ore until they died. But the November landscape, while cold, was nothing like the Arctic hell described in briefings. It was just winter, no worse than German winters, and the people here seemed to manage it just fine with their machines, and their fuel, and their wealth. And the cognitive dissonance built with every mile. Mueller kept mental notes, his teacher's instinct cataloging every contradiction. Hoffman's fear slowly mixed with confusion and something like hope. Weber felt his certainty cracking like ice under pressure. They'd been told lies about the journey. What else had been a lie? The question hung unspoken between them as the train carried them toward Camp Lethbridge, and a moment that would shatter everything they thought they knew. On November 15, 1943, the train finally arrived at their destination. Weber stepped off onto the platform and looked around at what was supposed to be his frozen prison. The POW camp sat on the flat prairie land just outside the small city. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows behind a barbed wire fence. Guard towers rose at the corners, but the guards inside them looked bored rather than threatening. Beyond the fence, Weber could see the town of Lethbridge itself, houses with smoking chimneys, streets with automobiles, the ordinary life of a country at peace while the world burned. The camp held about 600 German prisoners, mostly men captured in North Africa like themselves. A Canadian officer addressed the new arrivals through a translator. The camp layout was simple: sleeping barracks, a dining hall, a recreation building, a medical facility, and even a sports field. There was a canteen where prisoners could buy small items with money they'd earned from work assignments. Weber listened to all this with deep suspicion. It sounded too good, too organized, too humane for a death camp. The barracks were heated with wood stoves. When Weber walked into the one assigned to him, warmth hit his face like a physical thing. Real mattresses sat on metal bed frames, not the straw-filled sacks or bare boards he'd expected. Each man got multiple wool blankets and a small locker for personal belongings. Down the hall were showers with hot running water and flush toilets. Hoffman stared at the toilets as if he'd never seen such things. Many farms in rural Bavaria still used outhouses. Here, in a prison camp, they had indoor plumbing. The first dinner shocked them more than anything else so far. The dining hall smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread. Weber got in line with his tin plate, expecting watery soup and a crust of bread. Instead, the servers loaded his plate with roast beef, mashed potatoes, cooked vegetables, a thick slice of bread with real butter, and a piece of apple pie. Coffee steamed in his cup. He carried his plate to a table and just stared at it. Mueller calculated. This single meal had more calories than a full day's rations in Tunisia. Fresh milk sat in pitchers. Some prisoners ate immediately, starving. Others refused, fearing poison. One man cried while eating. This wasn't how you treated men you'd kill. After dinner, the camp commandant gave a formal orientation speech. Through the translator, he explained the rules and routines. Each prisoner would receive 3,000 calories of food per day. Work assignments would last 8 hours with weekends off. They would be paid 20 cents per day in camp scrip that could be spent at the canteen on chocolate, cigarettes, and toiletries. They could write 2 letters home each month, censored but permitted. Red Cross parcels would arrive monthly. Medical care would be provided as needed. Weber did the math in his head. German soldiers fighting in Russia were getting 1,500 calories a day, maybe less. These prisoners were getting double that. The work hours were shorter than a regular Wehrmacht duty day. Weekends off? German soldiers didn't get weekends off. The contradictions piled up so high that Weber's mind struggled to process them all. The next morning, a Canadian doctor examined each new prisoner. Weber was taken to the medical building, which looked cleaner and better equipped than any field hospital he'd seen during 2 years of war. The doctor spoke some German and was friendly in a professional way. He checked Weber's healing wounds, looked in his ears and throat, listened to his heart and lungs. When he discovered Weber had lost 2 teeth from poor nutrition, he scheduled a dental appointment, dental care, for prisoners. Hoffman was diagnosed with malnutrition and vitamin deficiency, conditions shared by most of the new arrivals from North Africa. The doctor prescribed vitamin supplements and extra rations until Hoffman's weight improved. He explained all this kindly, as if treating a regular patient rather than an enemy soldier. Hoffman left the medical building completely confused about what kind of captivity this was supposed to be. That first night, arguments filled the barracks. Hardliners insisted this was temporary. Germany would win, then executions would come. But Weber's certainty was cracking. Through the window, guards laughed casually. Beyond them, Lethbridge's electric lights burned freely. Hoffman pulled his blankets up to his chin, amazed at how warm he felt. The wood stove crackled pleasantly in the center of the room. His stomach was full for the first time in months. His body ached less now that he'd had that medical examination and been given ointment for his various pains. He thought about his mother back in Bavaria, probably cold and hungry, while he slept warm and fed in an enemy prison camp. The guilt was crushing, but so was the relief. Weber's last thought before falling asleep was about tomorrow. They would start work assignments in the morning. That's when the real nature of this place would reveal itself, he told himself. That's when the illusion would crack and the true horrors would begin. He had no idea that tomorrow would bring something far more shocking than horror. It would bring a machine that would destroy every certainty he'd ever held about the world and his place in it. Morning roll call came at 7 o'clock, and the prisoners were divided into work gangs. Weber, Hoffman, and Muller found themselves assigned to a railway maintenance crew working for the Canadian Pacific Railway. The CPR had a contract with the POW camp to provide labor for track maintenance and snow clearing operations. Their supervisor was a man named Jack Morrison, a 55-year-old former railway engineer with a gruff voice and calloused hands. He looked the prisoners over with a practical eye, not cruel, but not particularly friendly either. "Work hard and I'll treat you right," he said through the translator. "Yisha, slack off and we'll have problems. Fair enough?" The daily routine quickly established itself. Breakfast at 7 with eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. Transport to the worksite at 8 in covered trucks that kept them warm. Lunch break at noon with sandwiches, soup, and fruit packed by the camp kitchen. Work until 5, then back to camp for dinner at 6. After that, the evenings were their own for recreation, reading, or writing letters. On Sundays, there was no work at all, Men could play sports, attend religious services, or simply rest. Weber kept waiting for the trap to spring, for the cruelty to begin, but it never came. The work itself was hard physical labor, but nothing worse than regular soldier duties. They maintained railway tracks, cleared debris, and prepared equipment for the coming winter snow operations. Morrison worked alongside them sometimes, showing them the proper way to use tools or align tracks. He offered Weber a cigarette during a break one afternoon. Weber hesitated, then accepted. They stood together smoking, and Morrison asked about Hamburg's port, having worked on ships himself in his younger days. The conversation was brief and simple, but it troubled Weber deeply. Morrison saw him as a person, maybe even as a fellow working man, not as a monster or an enemy to be destroyed. Hoffman found himself working next to a young Canadian farmhand named Danny, who was 19 and cheerful in a way that seemed impossible during wartime. Danny was curious about Germany in the innocent way of someone who'd never left his home province. He asked questions about German food, German music, what the cities look like, nothing political, and just human curiosity. During lunch one day, Danny showed Hoffman a photo of his girlfriend. Without thinking, Hoffman pulled out his own carefully preserved photo of his sweetheart back in Bavaria. The two young men compared their pictures like any pair of boys talking about the girls they loved. "Guess we're all just fighting for the folks we love," Danny said quietly. The words hit Hoffman like a punch. The enemy had a face now, a family, feelings. The enemy was just like him. Muller observed everything with his teacher's eye, cataloging details that others might miss. The railway equipment was modern and well maintained. American-built locomotives pulled Canadian rolling stock, all of it newer than the increasingly decrepit trains he'd seen in Germany before his capture. The workers had proper tools for every job, and safety equipment that actually worked, and nobody seemed overworked or desperate. There was an efficiency to Canadian operations that spoke of abundant resources and good organization. When something broke, they had spare parts immediately available. When they needed materials, supplies arrived on schedule. This wasn't an economy struggling under wartime stress. This was an economy so strong that the war was barely slowing it down. Weber noticed farms as they passed through the countryside. Tractors and combines sat in fields, gasoline-powered machinery, doing work that German farms still accomplished, with horses and hand labor. The gap in technology was stunning. These weren't military secrets or advanced weapons. This was basic agricultural equipment that showed just how far ahead North America was in industrial development. The implications terrified him because they meant everything he'd believed about German superiority was built on lies. The camp allowed prisoners to write letters home, though everything was censored before being mailed. Hoffman wrote to his mother in early December. He wanted to tell her about the abundance, the decent treatment, the warmth and food and safety. But he knew censors would cut anything too specific, so he wrote simply, "I am treated well and have enough to eat. I learn English now. I miss home." When his mother's response arrived in February, it described worsening conditions in Bavaria, tighter rationing, constant fear of air raids, neighbors' sons killed on the Eastern Front. Hoffman read the letter and felt sick. He was eating better as a prisoner than his family was eating free in Germany. Evening life revealed more contradictions. The recreation hall had books, games, and instruments. Guards sometimes joined ice hockey games, playing alongside prisoners like equals. Mueller volunteered to teach English classes to other prisoners. The camp administration approved immediately and provided him with books and materials. Standing in front of a classroom again, even a makeshift one in a prison camp, felt right to Mueller. He realized he wasn't just teaching language, he was teaching his students to see the world differently. Every English lesson included observations about Canadian culture, democratic systems, and the value of questioning what you're told. Some prisoners resisted, clinging to Nazi ideology. But younger men like Hoffman soaked up knowledge like dry ground absorbing rain. The Canadian Guards were nothing like the brutal captors described in propaganda. They were informal with each other, calling one another by first names rather than rigid ranks. The military hierarchy seemed less strict than in the Wehrmacht. Most shocking of all, the guards ate the same food as the prisoners, just in a separate dining area. There were no special privileges for officers beyond separate sleeping quarters. Weber struggled with this casual equality. It felt wrong, according to everything he'd been taught about proper military order. But Hoffman found it comforting, this sense that Canadians saw all men as fundamentally equal, regardless of rank. December brought news that filtered into the camp through newspapers and official announcements. The Allies were advancing in Italy. Germany was being pushed back on multiple fronts. Hardline prisoners insisted these were temporary setbacks, that secret weapons would turn the tide. But Weber looked at the evidence around him, the endless supplies, the industrial capacity, the well-fed population, and knew in his heart that Germany couldn't win. You couldn't defeat an enemy that built specialized machines just to move snow off railway tracks. Miller kept a secret diary, writing in a simple code and hiding the pages in his mattress. If discovered, it could mean death, but the truth was too important to lose. He listed every contradiction between propaganda and reality: the food abundance, the medical care, the casual kindness, the technological superiority, the peaceful, prosperous countryside. Every entry was evidence that everything they'd been told about the Allies was a lie. And if that was a lie, when what else had been false? The racial theories? The promise of victory? The justification for the war itself? As Christmas approached, the camp administration announced they would hold a holiday celebration. Prisoners were skeptical. Surely this was propaganda, a staged event? But the preparations seemed genuine. Guards decorated the recreation hall with care, as if this actually mattered to them. Weber watched Canadian soldiers hanging lights and paper decorations, laughing and joking with each other. These men were going to celebrate Christmas with their enemies. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. Late one night, Hoffman whispered to Miller across the dark barracks, "What if everything we were taught was wrong?" Miller didn't answer immediately. Other prisoners were sleeping around them, and such questions were dangerous even here. Finally, he whispered back, "I think we both know the answer to that. The hard part is accepting it." Hoffman was quiet for a long moment. "I don't want to go back," he finally admitted. "I don't want to return to a Germany that lied to us like this." Miller understood completely. How could any of them go back to believing what they'd believed before? In mid-January, word spread through camp that Morrison would be bringing in special equipment to demonstrate winter railway operations. The prisoners didn't understand what this meant. Some rumors claimed it was a new kind of work machine. Others, darker whispers, suggested it might be an execution device. The paranoia that propaganda had planted in them still had roots, even after weeks of decent treatment. Whatever this machine was, they would see it soon. And for three men in particular, what they were about to witness would be the final blow to every lie they'd ever been told. A brutal cold snap hit southern Alberta in mid-January 1944. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below 0 Celsius, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Then came the snow. Over 60 centimeters fell overnight, the heaviest snowfall the region had seen in decades. The railway line, that ran past the camp was completely blocked, buried under massive drifts that rose higher than a man's head. This was a critical supply route, and Morrison explained they needed to clear it quickly. "We're bringing in the rotary plow," he told his work crew through the translator. "You'll want to see this." The prisoners didn't understand what a rotary plow was. There was no German word for it, no equivalent in their experience. Rumors spread through the camp that night. Some said it was a special machine for mining or construction. Others whispered darker theories. A few hardline Nazis claimed the Canadians were finally showing their true colors. This was the execution device they'd been waiting to use. The word spread. Tomorrow, they're bringing in a special machine. 50 German prisoners would be gathered to witness it. January 15th dawned bitterly cold and clear. Weber, Hoffmann, and Müller were among the group marched out to a railway siding near the camp. Canadian guards and civilian workers stood around, bundled in heavy coats, their breath creating clouds in the frozen air. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something. Then Weber felt it, a vibration in the ground beneath his feet, faint at first but growing stronger. Oh, a sound like distant thunder rolled across the prairie. In the distance, a massive locomotive appeared, pulling something Weber had never seen before. The front of the machine featured an enormous circular mechanism, at least 10 feet across, with metal blades arranged in a spiral pattern. Sharp teeth jutted out from the edges. As it came closer, the ground trembled more violently. Black smoke poured from the locomotive's stack. The rotating mechanism at the front looked like the mouth of some mechanical beast, waiting to devour whatever stood in its path. Terror rippled through the group of prisoners. Hoffmann went pale, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. "What is that thing?" someone whispered in German. Another prisoner answered with certainty born of propaganda and fear. "It's for grinding prisoners. And I heard they use machines like this." The panic was spreading. Several men looked around desperately for escape routes, but guards surrounded them on all sides. Weber's military training kicked in automatically. He assessed the situation, distance to the fence, number of guards, location of their weapons. If this was an execution, should he try to fight? Should he grab Hoffmann and run? Then Müller grabbed Weber's arm hard enough to hurt. "Wait," he hissed. "Look at the Canadians." Weber forced himself to look. Morrison was walking toward them with a huge grin on his weathered face. The other Canadian workers were smiling too, pointing at the approaching machine with obvious excitement. These weren't the faces of men about to commit murder. These were the faces of people eager to show off something impressive. Morrison reached the group of prisoners and spoke enthusiastically. The translator struggled to keep up. "Watch this, boys. This is a real engineering marvel. You're about to see something special." The locomotive positioned itself at the edge of the massive snowbank that blocked the tracks. Steam hissed from various valves. Then the engineer powered up the rotary mechanism. The blades began to spin, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until they became a blur of metal, rotating at over 100 revolutions per minute. The locomotive inched forward into the wall of snow. What happened next was so spectacular that several prisoners gasped out loud. The spinning blades hit the packed snow and exploded it into the air. A fountain of white spray shot 40 feet up and arced over the adjacent fields like water from a massive sprinkler. The machine moved forward at walking pace, maybe 3 or 4 kilometers per hour, but it carved through the drift as if the snow were made of paper. In seconds, it had cleared a path the width of the railway tracks, perfectly clean, down to the wooden ties and steel rails. Canadian workers cheered and clapped. Morrison turned back to the prisoners, still grinning. "That's how we keep the trains running in winter," he announced proudly. Then he saw the expressions on the prisoners' faces, the terror, the confusion, the dawning realization, and his smile faded, "What's wrong?" he asked. The translator explained haltingly that the prisoners had thought they were going to be executed with the machine. The color drained from Morrison's face. He looked horrified. "Kill you? It's a snowplow. It's for clearing tracks." He turned to the guards, who were equally shocked. One guard swore under his breath. "Jesus, is that what they told you we're like?" Morrison insisted the translator make absolutely clear what the machine was for: removing snow and nothing else, only snow, never anything else. He had the engineer demonstrate again, moving even more slowly so the prisoners could see exactly what was happening. Hoffman started laughing, a high-pitched sound edged with hysteria. The relief was so intense it came out as almost manic giggles. We thought you were going to kill us with it." Several other prisoners joined in the laughter. The kind of desperate laughter that comes after extreme fear passes. Some men dropped to their knees in the snow, overcome with relief. Others just stood frozen, still processing what they were seeing. Weber wasn't laughing, yet he was staring at the machine as it continued clearing the railway line, and his entire world view was collapsing like a building with its foundation removed. This machine existed solely to move snow. The Canadians had built it, maintained it, operated it, all for the single purpose of keeping trains running in winter. Back in Russia, German soldiers were freezing to death while clearing snow with their bare hands and shovels. The Wehrmacht couldn't spare resources for specialized snow equipment. They barely had enough trucks and tanks. But here was Canada, building machines for snow removal as casually as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The implications crashed over Weber like an avalanche. They have machines for snow, not for war, for snow. This wasn't a desperate nation barely holding on. This was a country so wealthy and so industrially powerful that they could afford to build specialized equipment for a task that came up maybe 20 days per year. Everything we were told was a lie. Every single thing. The Allies weren't desperate. They weren't collapsing. They weren't using primitive tactics. They were so far ahead that they solved minor inconveniences with engineering solutions that would be impossible dreams in Germany. Miller was having similar thoughts, his teacher's mind racing through the logical conclusions. A society at total war doesn't build snowplows. It builds weapons. The fact that this machine existed, that it was old, built in 1925, before any of this started, and that the Canadians maintained a whole fleet of them across their railway network, meant their industrial capacity was so vast that snow removal was a trivial problem. Germany was throwing every resource into the war effort and still losing ground. Canada could fight a war on multiple continents and still have resources left over for peacetime infrastructure. Hoffman's laughter had turned to tears. He was shouting at Morrison, words tumbling out in German too fast for the translator. "They made us believe you were monsters. We were so scared. Every single day, terrified." Morrison looked uncomfortable, sympathetic, deeply troubled by what he was hearing. "I'm sorry, son," he said through the translator. "War makes people say terrible things about each other. We're not monsters. We're just railway men trying to keep the trains moving." Morrison invited them closer. Weber, Müller, and Hoffman approached slowly. The engineer explained casually, built in 1925, cost $25,000. Warren, the CPR, owned 6 of them. The walk back to camp was silent. Some prisoners still tried to deny what they'd seen. "It's propaganda," one insisted. "They probably borrowed it from the Americans just to show us." But Weber shook his head. "I saw the maintenance logs. That machine was built in 1925, before the war, before we were enemies. This is normal for them. This is just how they operate." Miller added quietly, "The machine is real, and what it means is real too. That night, Weber couldn't sleep. He lay in his warm bunk under wool blankets in a heated barracks and replayed everything in his mind. The abundant food, the medical care, the casual wealth everywhere. And now this, a machine that represented industrial surplus on a scale Germany couldn't match. They showed it to us without fear, he realized. They weren't worried about military intelligence because this was civilian infrastructure, as common to them as shovels were to us. For the first time in his life, Ernst Weber allowed himself to think the forbidden thought all the way through to its conclusion. We cannot win this war. We never could. We were doomed from the moment we started. Hey, quick pause. Every video I make is about keeping these stories alive. Stories of young Canadians who gave everything and never got to tell their own tale. If you think that matters, hit subscribe. Help me make sure this all will never be forgotten. Now back to the video. The snowplow demonstration split the camp into factions. About 40% of the prisoners still clung to Nazi ideology, refusing to accept what their eyes had shown them. Another 30% were openly questioning everything they'd been taught, processing the implications of what they'd witnessed. The remaining 30% kept their heads down and stayed neutral, afraid to choose sides in case they picked wrong. Weber, Müller, and Hoffmann now belonged firmly to the questioning group, and it made them targets. The hardliners were led by Oberfeldwebel Krauss, a 45-year-old fanatic who'd been a Nazi party member since the early days. 3 days after the snowplow incident, Krauss cornered Weber in the barracks. "You've been broken by enemy propaganda," he spat. "You're spreading defeatism and corrupting the younger men." Weber met his eyes steadily. "I've been freed by enemy reality," he said. "Open your eyes, Krauss. Look at what's around us." Krauss's fist caught Weber across the jaw before he could react. Guards pulled them apart, and both men expected punishment. Instead, they were simply separated. Weber was moved to a different barracks with no other consequences. The light punishment frustrated Krauss even more than a beating would have. Weber moved to Barrack 7, the soft ones. Here, educated men accepted Germany was losing. Evening conversations covered philosophy, politics, and post-war futures. Weber taught younger prisoners the mathematics of defeat. Müller's role in camp evolved naturally. His English classes grew more popular each week, with over 50 prisoners attending by February. But he taught more than just language. Every lesson included exercises in critical thinking. Question everything, he told his students. Verify claims. Compare evidence to what you're told. He used the camp itself as a teaching tool, pointing out details his students might miss. Notice how much paper they throw away? They have surplus for single-use items. Count the light bulbs in this room. They illuminate a prison camp better than Berlin streets. What does that tell you about their resources? Hoffmann transformed fastest of all three men. At 21, he was young enough that his beliefs hadn't hardened into concrete. He befriended Canadian guards, especially MacDonald, who treated him almost like a younger brother. MacDonald brought newspapers and showed Hoffmann photographs of Allied advances on all fronts. The news was grim for Germany, pushed back in Italy, losing ground in Russia, now facing invasion from the West. We're losing. Aren't we? Hoffmann asked Weber one evening. Weber answered with painful honesty. We lost the moment we started fighting. We just didn't know it yet. Letters home became exercises in frustration. Hoffmann wrote to his mother in February, desperate to tell her about the abundance, the kindness, the safety he'd found. But censors would cut anything too detailed, so he wrote carefully, I am healthy and working. Food is adequate. I learn English now. May be useful after the war. What he wanted to write was that he ate better as a prisoner than she did at home. that the enemy showed more care for him than his own government ever had. When her response arrived in April, it described worsening conditions in Bavaria, stricter rationing, constant air raid warnings, young men from the village dying on the Eastern Front. Ers Hoffmann wept reading it, guilt crushing his chest. Weber wrote to his wife Hannah in Hamburg, trying to prepare her for changes he couldn't fully explain in a censored letter. The war is going badly. Prepare for the worst. I am safe and treated well. Do not believe horror stories about POW camps. Whatever happens, I will come home to you. He wanted to write that everything they'd been taught was lies, that he'd seen the future and Germany wasn't in it, that the world was so much larger and stranger than Nazi propaganda had allowed them to imagine. When Hannah's response came in May, she described Hamburg under constant bombing, living in basement shelters, the city slowly being destroyed around her. Weber felt sick with guilt that he was safe and warm while his wife suffered. The debates in the barracks grew heated as spring arrived. The Weber's group argued that the war was lost and they should accept reality, learn skills, and prepare for a post-war future. They cooperated enthusiastically with work assignments, learned English, studied Canadian farming methods. Krauss's hardliners insisted Germany would still win through secret weapons or force of will. They refused to learn the enemy language and did only the minimum required work. The silent majority in the middle watched both groups and waited to see which would be proven right. Canadian authorities noticed the ideological split, but handled it with characteristic patience. The commandant's policy was to encourage transformation without forcing it. Prisoners who cooperated got small privileges, extra canteen access, better work assignments, more recreation time, and hardliners were tolerated as long as they didn't cause violence. The Canadian approach was simple. Given time, decent treatment, and undeniable evidence, most men would come around on their own. By late 1944, this strategy was working. The majority of prisoners had shifted toward acceptance. Morrison developed real respect for Weber's work ethic and promoted him to crew foreman, putting him in charge of other German workers. Weber found himself managing prisoners under Canadian oversight, a position of trust he never expected to hold. One afternoon, Morrison said casually, "You're good at this railway work. Ever consider staying in Canada after the war?" Weber laughed, but the question planted a seed. Could he stay? Start a new life? Leave devastated Germany behind and build something here? But Hannah was in Hamburg. His duty was to her, trying to help rebuild what had been destroyed. Still, the possibility lingered in his mind. MacDonald's relationship with Hoffmann became almost paternal. He taught the young German how to play ice hockey during recreation time, showed him photographs of his family farm in Saskatchewan, talked about crops and seasons and the rhythms of prairie life. One day he said, "After the war, if you need work, look me up. Brother-in-laws always looking for good farmhands." Hoffmann realized the enemy was offering him a future, opportunity, a chance at a normal life. He compared this to Germany. What future waited there for a defeated soldier? What work would exist in a ruined country? The contrast was stark and painful. Easter 1944 brought transformation. At the chaplain service, Weber heard, "God sees no uniforms, or only souls." He wept, his first tears since capture. Afterward, the chaplain said, "Doubt is the beginning of wisdom." Muller had his own moment of transformation in April while teaching a class about Canadian government. A student asked how democracy could possibly work. Who made decisions if everyone had a vote? Muller explained parliamentary systems, elections, multiple political parties, peaceful transfers of power. As he spoke, he realized he was teaching ideas that Nazi ideology called weak, chaotic Jewish conspiracies, but the evidence was all around them. Canada was stable, prosperous, powerful, and democratic. Germany was totalitarian and losing on every front. Maybe democracy wasn't weak. Maybe it was stronger. The thought was dangerous enough to get him executed if Germany won. But he taught it anyway because truth mattered more than fear. Hoffmann turned 22 in May, and the Canadian workers threw him a small birthday party. Morrison brought a cake with candles, and everyone sang "Happy Birthday" in English. Hoffmann was overwhelmed. The enemy was celebrating his life, treating his birthday as something that mattered. He thought of friends who died in Tunisia, of his brother still fighting somewhere in the east, of the Wehrmacht that had sent him to die in a desert for a lie. Then he looked at these Canadians singing to him, and the answer to an unspoken question became clear. These people valued human life more than the Reich ever had. The government that claimed to care about German blood had thrown it away by the millions. These foreigners, these supposed enemies, gave him cake and sang to him on his birthday. News of D-Day reached the camp on June 6th. Allied forces had landed in Normandy. Guards celebrated while hardline prisoners insisted it was a temporary setback that Germany would soon reverse. Weber's group studied the maps and did the mathematics. Thousands of ships, millions of men, industrial capacity demonstrated on a massive scale. The snowplow train multiplied 1,000,000 times. Younger prisoners were doing the calculations too, and the conclusions were inescapable. Krauss's influence was fading as evidence mounted that the war was truly lost. By summer's end, the transformation was nearly complete. 60% of the camp now accepted reality. Only 15% remained hardline believers. The rest had given up neutrality and chosen acceptance. The camp atmosphere grew more cooperative and peaceful. Work output improved. Discipline problems decreased. The Canadian model of patience and decent treatment was working exactly as planned. Mueller's secret diary had grown to over 50 pages, all carefully hidden in his mattress seam. He documented everything: the food, the medical care, the technology, the casual wealth, the democratic society. He analyzed why Germany had lost before the fighting even began. Free societies innovate, he wrote. Dictatorships stagnate. We were doomed from the start. The snowplow train proved it. Someday, if he survived, he would publish this diary. Germany would need to understand what had gone wrong, why the lies had been so complete, how to build something better from the ruins. As 1944 drew toward its close, 3 men who'd arrived as terrified prisoners were becoming something else. Students of a system they'd been taught to hate, witnesses to truths that contradicted everything they'd known, and reluctant believers in the possibility that the enemy might actually be right about democracy, freedom, and human dignity. The snowplow train had cleared more than snow that January day. It had cleared a path through decades of propaganda, and now 3 men walked that path toward an uncertain future, carrying knowledge that would make going home almost impossible. The news came on April 30th, 1945. Hitler was dead by his own hand in a bunker beneath burning Berlin. A week later, on May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The camp commandant gathered all 600 prisoners in the yard and announced that the war in Europe was over. Weber stood in formation listening to those words and felt nothing like he'd expected. There was relief that the killing had stopped, grief for his destroyed homeland, fear for Hannah, whose last letter had been months ago, and guilt, crushing guilt that he'd been safe and warm and well-fed while Germany burned. Hoffmann cried openly, and he wasn't alone. Dozens of young prisoners wept for wasted years, for dead friends, for the homes they'd never see again or would find in ruins. MacDonald stood nearby, his hand resting gently on Hoffman's shoulder. "You'll be all right, son," he said quietly. But Hoffman shook his head. "Will I? What's left to go home to?" The question hung in the air with no good answer. Müller remained quiet, his teacher's mind already shifting to what came next. He thought of Dresden, and firebombed in February just 3 months earlier. His sister Greta had lived there. He'd received no letters from her since January. Deep down, he knew she was dead, consumed by the same fire that had killed 30,000 others in a single night. He clutched his hidden diary, now over 100 pages. This knowledge was why he'd survived. Germany would need truth-tellers to rebuild properly. The hardliners had one last moment of denial. Krauss and his remaining followers, maybe 30 men out of 600, insisted the surrender was fake propaganda. Germany had secret weapons, they claimed. Hitler would return. They would resist until the Reich rose again. The camp administration tolerated this delusion with the same patience they'd shown for 3 years. Let time and evidence do the work. Within months, even Krauss would have to accept reality. Repatriation would take months. Europe was devastated. Camp life continued, but different now. An immigration program was announced. Canada needed agricultural workers. Hoffman's hand shot up immediately. This was home now. Weber wrestled with a harder choice. In July, he finally received a letter from Hannah. She'd survived. She was living with her sister in the countryside outside Hamburg. The city was 60% destroyed, she wrote. No work, little food, devastation everywhere. "Come home," she pleaded. "We'll rebuild together." Weber stared at that letter for hours. Morrison's offer still stood: good railway work, decent pay, a future in Canada. He could bring Hannah here, start fresh. But could she forgive his transformation? Could she accept the new Weber who questioned everything their old world had taught them? Hoffman applied for the agricultural immigration program in August. MacDonald's brother-in-law in Saskatchewan needed farmhands and agreed to sponsor him. But Canadian immigration required family permission from Germany. Hoffman wrote the hardest letter of his life to his mother. "I want to stay in Canada and build a new life here. Please understand. Please give me your blessing." The wait for her response was agony. When it came in November, he wept reading her words. "If you must stay away, at least you'll be safe and fed. You have my blessing, my son. Be happy." Müller was granted permission to teach full-time while waiting for repatriation. He created an educational program preparing prisoners for democratic Germany, civics, accurate history, economics, critical thinking, over 200 men enrolled. "We must return not as defeated soldiers, but as educated citizens," he told his students. "Germany needs builders, thinkers, questioners. We must ensure the lies that destroyed us never take root again." The camp administration supported him fully, providing books, materials, and classroom space. The final months in Canada carried a bittersweet quality. Men prepared for diverging futures, some returning to Germany, some staying in Canada, some still uncertain. Friendships had formed across what used to be enemy lines, and now those friendships faced separation. Morrison and Weber had their last day of work together in December 1945. "Damn shame you're going back," Morrison said. "Best foreman I ever had." Weber shook his hand firmly. "I have to see my wife. Nay, Germany needs rebuilding, and I must be part of that." Morrison nodded understanding. "If it doesn't work out, you've got a place here. Remember that." Weber thanked him, his voice thick with emotion. "You treated me like a man, not an enemy. I'll never forget that." Morrison smiled sadly. You were never an enemy to me, Ernst. Just another working man trying to get by. In January 1946, MacDonald drove Hoffman to Saskatchewan to meet his sponsor. The long drive was mostly silent, both men processing the goodbye. "Proud of you, kid," MacDonald finally said. "Takes real courage to start over in a foreign country." Hoffman's eyes were wet. "You saved my life. Not from death, from hate. You showed me people could be decent across any divide." MacDonald's own voice wavered. "You saved your own life by being willing to learn. I just helped clear the path." Hoffman smiled through tears, like a snowplow train. They both laughed and cried. At the farm, they shook hands one last time. "Write to me," MacDonald said. "Let me know how you do." Hoffman promised he would. Muller taught his final class in February 1946 to 50 graduating students. He handed out certificates the camp had made, simple paper, but meaningful. "Return to Germany with open eyes and open minds," he told them. "Question authority. Demand evidence. Think critically. Build a Germany worthy of your children." The students applauded, many weeping. Muller's diary was carefully hidden for the journey home. If the wrong people found it, he'd be executed. But the knowledge was too important to destroy. The transport ship left Halifax in March, carrying Weber and Muller among hundreds of repatriated POWs. Hoffman stayed behind, beginning his new Canadian life. The goodbye at the dock was emotional. 3 men who'd arrived together 3 years ago were splitting forever. They promised to write, to stay in touch, to remember what they'd learned together. Then Weber and Muller boarded the ship and watched Canada fade into the distance. The Atlantic crossing reversed their arrival. "Everything's different now," Weber said. "I'm different." The ship carried POWs, telling similar stories: abundance, decent treatment, shattered propaganda. Then came occupied Germany. The devastation was worse than imagined. Weber whispered, "My God, what have we done?" The contrast to Canadian abundance was absolutely stark. There, people complained about minor shortages. Here, families starved in cellars. There, electric lights burned freely. Here, cities sat dark and broken. There, machines cleared snow from railways. Here, there were barely any functioning railways left to clear. The full weight of defeat crushed down on every returning prisoner as they crossed into the wasteland that used to be Germany. Weber reached Hamburg in May after weeks of searching and found Hannah living in a basement with 3 other families. Their reunion was joyful but strained. She'd aged 10 years in 3. He looked healthy and well-fed, which made his guilt unbearable. That first night, cramped in the cellar with no privacy, Hannah whispered, "You look so well. We've been starving." Weber felt sick. "I ate better as a prisoner than you did free." He wanted to tell her everything he'd learned, but it was too dangerous, too painful, too soon. She noticed the change in him, though. "You're different." What happened there? Weber could only say, "I learned the truth about everything. We'll talk when it's safer." Muller arrived in Dresden to find 90% of the city destroyed. His sister was confirmed dead in the February firebombing. Standing in the ruins of her home, Muller held his diary close. "This is for you, Greta," he whispered to the ashes. "Truth will rebuild what lies destroyed." With no family left, he immediately sought out education authorities in the British occupation zone and offered his services. He had knowledge Germany desperately needed, even if he had to hide how he'd gained it. The winter of 1946 to 47 was the coldest in decades, and Germany had almost no fuel. People froze in unheated buildings while food shortages brought widespread starvation. Weber worked brutal reconstruction labor in Hamburg's ruined port, thinking constantly of heated Canadian barracks and 3 meals a day. One night, shivering under thin blankets, he thought about the snowplow train and almost laughed at the dark irony. They have machines for snow, he remembered. We're freezing with nothing. Letters from Hoffman arrived regularly, describing his new Canadian life, working on a farm, learning to drive tractors, meeting a girl, getting engaged. Weber read them to Hannah, evidence of the path he'd chosen not to take. "Do you wish you'd stayed?" she asked quietly. Weber answered honestly, "Sometimes, but you're here. Oh, Germany needs us both to rebuild." It was true, but some nights he wondered what life would have been like if he'd accepted Morrison's offer and brought Hannah to a country where snowplow trains cleared paths to the future instead of the past. The 1950s brought slow recovery to Germany and diverging paths for 3 men shaped by a Canadian prison camp. Weber rebuilt Hamburg's port using lessons learned from Canadian railway work. When Marshall Plan money arrived in 1948, he pushed for mechanization, worker safety programs, and efficient systems that respected laborers rather than just using them. By 1952, he was promoted to port operations manager. Hamburg's port became a model for West German reconstruction, and Weber credited his approach to what Morrison had taught him, that respecting workers and improving systems created better results than fear and punishment. He and Hannah had 2 children, a daughter in 1949 named Greta after Müller's sister, and a son in 1953 named Klaus after Hoffman. The family rebuilt their lives from the ashes, and Weber stayed in touch with his Canadian friends through letters that crossed the ocean regularly. Müller escaped Soviet-controlled Dresden in 1949 and moved to West Berlin, where he was hired by the Education Ministry to help rebuild Germany's school system. His mission was democratization, teaching students to think critically, question authority, and demand evidence rather than accepting propaganda. He used his POW experience as a blueprint, though he kept the details vague at first. In 1952, he published his secret diary under the title Snowplow: How Truth Cleared My Path. The book became a minor bestseller in West Germany and sparked controversy. Some praised his honesty about how Allied captivity had opened his eyes. Others condemned him as a defeatist who'd been corrupted by enemy propaganda. Müller defended his work simply. Truth is uncomfortable but necessary for democracy. He never married, pouring his energy into students who became his family, determined that the next generation would never fall for the lies that had destroyed his. Hoffman married Sarah Mitchell in April 1947 on her father's Saskatchewan farm. They had 3 children, Anna in 1948, Thomas in 1951, and Emma in 1954. He became a successful farmer, adopting Canadian methods and eventually expanding his operation into one of the region's largest. He gained Canadian citizenship in 1952 and never returned to Germany permanently, though his mother visited him in 1956. When she saw his prosperous farm, his healthy children, and his peaceful life, she wept and told him, "I understand why you stayed." Hoffman's English became perfect with only a slight accent. His children grew up Canadian, learning German from their father, but belonging completely to their adopted country. He helped other German immigrants settle in the area and told his story at schools, a tale of transformation, integration, and choosing love over hate. In June 1960, 15 years after the war's end, MacDonald organized a reunion at Lethbridge. Former POWs and their Canadian guards and supervisors gathered to remember those strange years when enemies became something closer to friends. Weber traveled from Hamburg or his first time back in Canada since leaving in 1946. Hoffman drove from his Saskatchewan farm. Mueller flew from Berlin on his first transatlantic flight. Morrison, now retired, hosted a dinner at his home. They visited the old camp, weathered buildings, sagging roofs. Weber stood silent, flooded with memories. Hoffman touched a wall. "This place saved my life." Miller nodded. "Changed all our lives." Morrison arranged a special visit to the CPR depot, where the snowplow train was kept. The same Leslie rotary snowplow, now 35 years old, still sat on the tracks in working condition. The engineer demonstrated its operation, clearing a test section of old snow. 4 men watched, 3 former POWs and 1 former guard, 16 years after that terrifying January morning. Weber laughed, in the sound carrying genuine amusement now rather than fear. "I was so terrified of this thing. I really thought you'd kill us with it." Morrison shook his head, still troubled by the memory. "The fact that you believed that shows how badly propaganda had poisoned your minds." Hoffman said, "This machine taught me to question everything I'd been told." Miller added, "It's in my book." Chapter 5, The Machine That Changed Minds. They took photographs, creating a historical record of 4 men and the machine that had transformed them. The formal dinner that evening brought together over 30 people, former prisoners, guards, and civilians who'd worked with the POWs. Stories flowed freely about work details, ice hockey games, English lessons, and the slow transformation from suspicion to understanding. Weber gave a short speech. "We came as enemies. You made us human again." Morrison responded simply, "You were always human. We just reminded you." Miller presented signed copies of his book to the Canadian hosts. Hoffman introduced his family, Sarah and their 3 children. His daughter Anna, 12 years old, said, "Daddy never stops talking about this place." Weber knelt down to her level. "Your father is a brave man. He had the courage to admit he'd been wrong and to build something new. Never forget that." Late that night, the 3 former POWs sat on Morrison's porch, smoking and talking under prairie stars. Weber asked Mueller, "Do you ever regret returning to Germany?" Mueller considered the question carefully. "No. Germany needed teachers, needed people willing to tell the truth. It's been hard, but necessary." Hoffman asked the mirror question, "Do you regret staying in Canada?" He shook his head. "Never. This is home now. But I miss Germany sometimes. Miss what it could have been." Weber admitted, "I think about Morrison's offer every winter when things are hard. But Hannah's in Hamburg. Our children are German. We have to fix what we broke." Mueller said, "We are fixing it. Your port work, my schools, Hoffman's example of successful integration. 3 different paths from one snowplow train." The years passed, and the 3 men aged into their stories. Weber retired in 1982 at 70, having overseen Hamburg's transformation into one of Europe's most efficient ports. Hannah died in 1985, and Weber lived alone afterward, maintaining his Canadian correspondence until the end. Weber died in 2003 at 92. Mueller continued his educational reform work through the 1980s, and living to see the Berlin Wall fall in November 1989. At 83, he wept watching that barrier crumble on television. "Finally," he whispered, "finally, we're whole again." He died in 2006 at 101 years old, having published his final memoir about living through a century of German history from empire to democracy. Hoffman became a pillar of his Saskatchewan community, honored by the province in 1984 for his agricultural contributions. He returned to Bavaria once in 1990, visiting his mother's grave and the farm where he'd grown up. Bavaria was prosperous now, rebuilt and thriving. He realized both he and his homeland had survived and transformed in parallel. He died peacefully in 2012 at 90, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who carried forward his story. In 1994, 50 years after the snowplow incident, a documentary crew filmed the 3 elderly survivors at Lethbridge. Weber was 82, Miller 88, and Hoffman 72. Morrison and MacDonald had both passed away. The interviews captured their reflections on what that moment had meant. Weber told the camera, "I was a true believer who thought Canada would be hell. Instead, they showed me humanity and truth. That snowplow train was a weapon against ignorance. It cleared propaganda from our minds like snow from tracks." Miller added, "Totalitarian societies can't build machines for snow removal. They spend everything on weapons and control. Free societies build abundance, then machines for convenience. That's what transformed us." Hoffman's voice shook with emotion. "I thought that machine would kill me. Instead, it taught me how to live. I never went back to Germany because I couldn't. This became home. I'm Canadian now, but I remember being German, and I remember the day a machine taught me that enemies are just people on different sides of a conflict." They visited the snowplow one final time, now 69 years old, but still operational. CPR maintained it as a historical artifact. 3 elderly men stood before the massive machine in January snow while cameras rolled. Hoffman touched the blade gently. "Thank you for my life." Miller said, "Thank you for the truth." Weber added, "Thank you for showing us what we could have been all along." The photograph taken that day became iconic. 3 old men, 1 enormous machine, and the snow that connected them across decades. The legacy lived on. Camp Lethbridge became a historical site. The snowplow train went to the Canadian Railway Museum. Their families established a scholarship for historical studies, emphasizing critical thinking and questioning propaganda. The final message was simple but profound. A machine built to clear snow had cleared something far more important, a path through hatred to understanding, through propaganda to truth, through war to peace. 3 men had walked that path and spent their lives helping others find it. They proved that transformation is always possible, that enemies can become friends, and that truth and kindness are more powerful than lies and fear. All it takes is the courage to question what you've been taught and the humanity to recognize yourself in others. The snowplow train stood as a monument to that possibility. Its massive blade a reminder that sometimes the simplest truths, like a machine designed only to move snow, can change everything.